Yes, and you have to talk about the various strata because it was a stratified group of coworkers. On the level of the administrators, they were aligned strictly on maintaining the status quo, which we considered was an unacceptable status quo. When it came to the other physicians, at the most there might have been a couple who were not willing to completely oppose us, but most of them were in opposition to Bill and I and our efforts, and that was for a lot of reasons that Bill has laid out, but they became very much our opposition, our other physicians, not on any professional basis, but on the basis of them being threatened by the position that we were taking.
But irrelevant, because they had no power. And the administration disregarded them altogether, and after we tried to recruit them into a principled program of reform, including health reform policy at the state level as a union, as an association, we just realized that given the fact that they were marginalized and unwilling and unable to identify with the interests of the people in the institution or the families, that, I mean, they were just literally, they were invisible. They were helpless, useless, didn't threaten us, never really made any dangerous inroads to undermine the program. They were lost, like lost children, orphans. They didn't even understand what the hell was going on.
How did that change?
It didn't. They hired a couple, 3 new doctors that were sort of okay, but doctors are always part of the problem. They're never part of the solution as an organized group, ever, ever.
In the heart of the time when we were working there, it was true that they had employed physicians who, for reasons of being displaced persons after World War II and things like that, were finding it difficult to get licensed and have a job. And so they had no job security there and were in a bad position to try to take any position with us.
Right. Like undocumented workers. I mean, they were really vulnerable.
You're right. And so then the next strata would be the professionals in the administration building, the social workers and the psychologists. The social workers I found to be a great group of people. Mm-hmm. They were very understaffed, but they were committed to principles of social work, to trying to place people on the outside and advocate for the patients. And working in the Department of Social Service was my friend Bernard Carabello, who was a patient at that time, an inmate. He had lived there from the age of 3, and he was getting to be about 18 and 19 years old, and he was a man with cerebral palsy, not at all retarded, very wise, and the social workers recognized that, and he was a working boy there. He was pushing them up in their department, and he was very articulate and given them an earful about the conditions there, and has always been a strong advocate. Even when he was still living there, he, with good humor, would point out the shortcomings of that institution. So we had great relationships with virtually all of the social workers. The psychologists were another story. They were only there to do testing. They weren't doing any therapy. And I only remember an administrative psychologist who was there. He was supporting the administrative position at all times. The administrative physicians, there were, it was dominated, the top echelons by physicians. There was an administrator and a co-administrator. They were longtime veterans of the system. They were committed to the institutional model and didn't like what we were doing. And Bill has talked about Dr. Hammond, and there was a Dr. Jacobs.
And a Dr. Jim Murphy was the third guy, who was kind of a sweetie but just had no clout.
Then there would be the building supervisors, and they would usually...
Wait, let me just one. There's also, remember, a whole gamut of consultants, of medical consultants, who we were able to play and use, the better ones and the worse ones, to help us deal with some of the medical emergencies, because part of the problem was dealing with day-to-day, saving people's lives and dealing with their rampaging medical problems. So that was another crowd that we never saw face to face, but were a very critical force. And ultimately, when the real changes began to happen at Willowbrook, better consultants were brought in, and the requirement for all medical services to be moved from inside the institution to Bellevue, so that anytime things needed, we began to be in a position to be able to put people directly into mainstream medical situations for services. And finally, the third marginal group was the research group of super professionals that were completely invisible, working in this concentration camp research, kind of Meningala, kind of center, very, very opulent, very rich, beautiful place where all the viral research was going on, all the tropical disease research was going on, and they had this perfect place by just allowing it to do all the research. So that finishes the medical professional line of associates that we had potential access to decide, do we bring them in, do we keep them out, what role do they play? There was a huge effort in the institutional struggle to focus on the viral research stuff, the immoral, the unethical, viral research work that was going on, which never interested me, ever. I mean, it was, but a lot of people hung on to that agenda, and that was a very serious feature of the struggle that also impacted all the workers, because everybody was aware that they were in a terribly dangerous medical situation. I mean, terribly dangerous. You could catch anything anytime that was potentially mortal, which is why the docs in the hospital, they would never walk on the ward. So the supervisors.
Right. So then we had the building supervisors, and each of the buildings, the 27 buildings that had inmates in them, had a supervisor for that building that answered to the administration building. And they were a mixed batch of people. They sort of didn't know what to make of us. Then there was the registered nurses. We would encounter them largely when we were on call. I mean, we would encounter the registered nurses and licensed practical nurses in our own buildings on a regular basis, but we would then, when we were on call, as Bill mentioned, be called to all the buildings in the institution. And gradually, over the years that we worked there, we got to know them all and found them to be, generally very helpful and wanting to be professional, but limited by their lack of a good environment to be working in. And very welcoming, in my experience, to our approach, and happy that we were willing to examine the inmate that we were being called to see. And then the medication passers, we would be trying to cut down on the medications, as Bill mentioned, feeling that they were chemical straitjackets and so on. And so there were some individual patients that were having paradoxical reactions to medications, that they would be taking tranquilizers, but they would be running all over the place. And so trying to iron that out and working with the medication administrators, some of whom we would find were actually deciding on their own to give the certain patients more medication than was prescribed, and just trying to communicate with them on that level. And then the attendants. Each one you had to take as an individual, because some of them really cared and would be doing the best they could in their own way of coping with an adverse situation, and others of whom really didn't care and just didn't want to be there and were clearly there to collect a paycheck, but would respond to duties that were laid out for them in a minimal way. So it was a mixed picture, and we had to smile. It was a very difficult situation for everybody, and one of our jobs was to introduce the concept of trying to change the place and change the paradigm, and neutralize the opposition of these workers. They might have a feeling of hostility toward us, or at least caution, because we were talking about totally different things than the other physicians. But by showing them that we related to them, we could help, at least by our example and our demeanor, bring them along with us. And we tried to always explain the genesis of the problems that would be occurring, and I think many of them did get that, and was a reason why ultimately, even though their organizations may have wanted them to oppose us, they didn't truly, in a gut way, oppose the changes that we were talking about.
How do you think that eventually got through to them? Was it on your personal relationship? Was it just a chain of events?
There was a change of events that was quite aside from our efforts to establish personal relationships with them. Once there was a television expose, they did have to take sides to a large degree. But before that time, when we were working there for the years that we did, they were coming over, I believe, to realizing in their minds, you know, they sort of began to see the situation before the public did. They were working inside this place, and they could, I would hope, and I think that it was true, and we would be talking to them about how inappropriate it can be for a child or any person with developmental disabilities to be in a place where they have no opportunities. And these employees also had limited opportunities in their lives, and so injustice can be recognized, and we were talking about that.
It's interesting. I was always ready, and I'm sure Mike was too, to rat on the other docs for malpractice practices. And it was common, and I put it in the notes, that what had been given was inappropriate. I changed the orders, whatever. We never, ever brought action, I don't think that I can remember, against a worker for any kind of abuse, ever. And it just struck me, I was just thinking about that there was never an antagonistic relationship with the attendant level or supervisory staff, not even really super harsh words with them about stuff, because basically we were thrown into the same pit together, and it was swim or sink together. And we had, I think, tremendous relationships and depended upon the ward workers, because without their eyes and ears, man, I mean, you know, they were the ones that were there 24/7 in shifts. They knew it. If they wouldn't bring us stuff, we wouldn't see it. If they wouldn't tell us what was going on, we wouldn't know it. Because, you know, we were outsiders, you know, really outsiders. We had our offices, and even though we didn't stay in our offices, the intercourse with the ward staff was essential. I mean, we needed to be loved by them. We needed to be trusted by them. And conversely, we depended upon them as coworkers and peers. There was no sense of being better than they. On the contrary, we depended upon them. We were their tools. We were their instruments for sorting out problems. And to the extent that we could stimulate and invite them to be more progressive and more advocacy-oriented, we would do our job better. What was very interesting was that when I was in Building 76, what resulted in my expulsion from that building was my attempt to reorganize the wards and the interdiction of Big Nurse and her cohorts to block that change. My nurse, who I thought was with the program, ratted me out with the administration. And she went there and she just said, "We will not do this. This is unreasonable. I can't." She was on the edge of control, and it gave me for the first time an insight of stuff I didn't really realize and understand, of the kinds of influences that played upon the nurses. That there was an underground, there was a gangster element, a gangster quote unquote, in the workers, because there was a lot of money there to be taken. There was theft from the residents, because their families would bring stuff and the stuff would disappear. There was all sorts of goods that were trafficking there. God knows how much medicine disappeared that got, you know, said this was going to go to somebody but wind up somewhere else, you know. There was a lot of mayhem between the workers, a lot of aggressive, you know, tire slashing, some people getting killed, you know, and nobody knew what was going on. This was a city. I mean, you're talking about a city. So there was all sorts of elements in there, and we didn't know intimately who was good, who was bad, who was doing it, who was not. We never caught a worker beating anybody. We always saw evidence of the brutality, you know, key welts on people, and only the workers carried keys. I mean, terrible kinds of things happening, and obviously saw the way in which the resident population was commandeered to do slave work, to do indentured serf work. So it was a very interesting kind of a deal, but one thing that became really clear to us was that the heart of our work was embedded in the body of the workers. If we were pumping the blood, they were making things, whatever happened, happen. What I mean by pumping the blood is pumping the notion of a new way of seeing themselves, seeing the work, seeing the issues, seeing us. And the administration understood that coldly because they had for years and years and years been able to depend upon manipulating the mass of workers, either through direct control of administrative orders or through the kind of neo-colonial control of the CSEA worker leadership who were their bedfellows. And these people got all sorts of benefits in order to make sure that business was run as usual. And you know, the rationale for it was a good rationale. It was to keep things working as best they could in a situation that was explained as this is the best we can get because nobody cares about us. We're at the bottom of the barrel. I'm doing my best as the director of the institution. You know, we have to fight with the legislature every year. They cut our money, so, you know, that's how it is. And, you know, I mean, if we didn't do that, who the hell else would do this? You know this is a thankless job. You know that this work is you know, sort of the work of high moral, high ethical, high dedicated people. And so at some level, people never want to see themselves as abusers. They only want to see themselves as holding up the torch as high as possible and doing the best work as possible. And if keeping the lid on and keeping people from killing each other by drugging them practically to death was the answer, well, you know, one strategy was preferable to the other because one was a matter of negligence, the other was a matter of intention. And intention was crucial. Now, the problem was that even at their best, nobody was ready to reorganize the institution around rational, scientific, educational, principle-based, policy-driven, individually respectful-based services. We were required at one point by the doctor, his name was Milton Jacobs, who was the deputy director. Big cigar smoking, you know, he was the guy, you know, took care of the business in the place and kind of was sort of our friend, you know, but, you know. And Medicare, the federal government required what they call utilization review, which was a phenomenal breakthrough for us. The feds required every single individual to be comprehensively reviewed every 6 months and a plan set up, a description of the people in order to get the reimbursement. This was a crucial instrument in ensuring reimbursement. Without these utilization reviews being done, no money would come. And so Jacobs came to the doctor meeting, which we had every week or so. What we had every week, every 2 weeks, yeah, something like that. And he said, you know, I want you to make sure that when you look at the people that you're taking care of, the residents, you make sure that you make sure that they are extra disabled because we're going to need the money. And the more disabled they were, the more money we got. So Mike and I said to him, you know, are you kidding? You're asking us to misrepresent and to submit fraudulent federal stuff and sign that? You were out of your mind. I mean, we said it in the meeting, you know, we're gonna write it the way we see it. We're gonna write the truth. If you don't like it, do something about it. So we began in our wards, one at a time, looking at people, and those obligatory meetings gave us a real chance to traffic with our coworkers at a very intimate level around the reality of each kid, not the label, but what was the circumstances, what was going on with that kid, what were they possible of, and to find out who that person was in the afternoon shift and in the night shift, because they could have been a totally different person showing up there, because everybody had their own turtle kind of garb in which to pull their head and feet into. And we began to then use that as an incredible way to get our coworkers to understand them, to have a systematic look at people. But the problem was that it took a lot of time to run one of those reviews on somebody. I mean, it took an hour or so to sit down and get everybody's input.
And I would have I don't know where you had your staffing meeting about how each individual inmate was doing, but I would have them on the ward so that the ward attendants would be there, and just the simple act of walking out there on the ward and relating to the residents, the inmates that would come up. Some of them would come up to us, be happy to see us,
Always.
and to greet them in a human way, as though they were a human being. And to greet the employees, the attendants, as if they were a human being. That was really important, so that we would be all working together toward a common goal, because we really weren't separate when you got right down to it, as Bill has pointed out. We were all thrown into this situation, doctors, attendants, and inmates. We were there. We had to deal with each other.
Well, you gentlemen saw yourselves all working together with kind of a common interest, but is that the way the other workers saw it?
I think some did. You know, I believe that there were so many different kinds of workers. Many of our workers came from Newark. Some of the workers came from Staten Island,
Bronx, everywhere.
Many different parts
2 and
of
3
New York
hours
City.
to get to work and back.
And you know, they manifested their moods and their attitudes in different ways on different days, and it was a difficult situation. It wasn't an optimistic situation. Nobody could be too smiley-faced there, but they all found a way to respond to the situation and adapt to it. So I believe, and I really know this, that they loved the fact that we were there and stirring up some change.
For sure.
And they would smile, but they wouldn't necessarily side with us in a public way, but they were glad we were there. They kind of understood it, and because they came out of a life of struggle themselves.
There was an element of black nationalists very actively involved in the worker community. It was always a secret operation. We never could really figure out who. We were never told, we never could find out who belonged to this organization called the International Union for Advancement, the IUA. But what was curious about the IUA was it was there when I got there. And that was one of the reasons why I gave up on trying to create a progressive union solution to dealing with the institutional problem, was because on the one hand, CSEA was there, entirely run by the administration, with major senior supervisors being the people running the union, which meant that the low-down workers had no shot at all for any kind of redress of grievances. And on the other hand, this idiosyncratic black nationalist group that had been somehow approved by the Attorney General's office, that had union dues checkoff, can you believe that, with no representation of the workers, and the union dues checkoff information would go straight to the Attorney General, and nobody checked that trick out. We could never find the main office of IUA, which was supposedly in Harlem. I mean, here's a legitimate organization, respected by the administration. So obviously these were people clearly that were working, in a counterinsurgency way, in self-interest, essentially. And we were white docs in a black world. And so one of the things that always was there was to what extent we could reach over in a loving way, in a comradely way, to black workers at the level that we were capable of and open to working with. Because remember, we're working on the street throughout New York City with the Black Panther Party, the Young Lords Party. These people were family for us. I mean, family for us. We depended upon the integrity of the radical communities of color for our life's work as change agents and as justice seekers. I mean, I don't know what you want to call us. And so in the institution, it was the same kind of a way. And so the way in which the administration and CSEA and the IUA worked was to always keep us off balance as white boys, and that we had no business or no real interest in those workers, and that we could leave any time we wanted to leave, that we had endless salaries and privileges and MD degrees, true as it was, and that we were going to leave everybody in a lurch, and if they stuck their neck out, boy, they were going to go down, and we weren't going to go down. And so we had to demonstrate that we would stick our necks out the farthest, that we would be there no matter what, you know, and that it was a no-quarter war, and that it was for the right reason, and that what this was all about was human dignity, human integrity, human life, you know, self-fulfillment, work fulfillment, professional growth, improvement in life. That was not a CSEA agenda. That was not an IUA agenda, and it certainly wasn't the plantation runners' agenda. And we never could communicate the role of that. Now, on the other hand, here's the administration who's got to have the workers on their side, because the way the workers leaned determined the administration's life or death. If they couldn't manipulate the union to be essentially neutral, at least neutral, they were in really deep trouble. They understood the power of the organized working class clearly. They made sure that there could not be a self-conscious working class organization. And so you had a lot of workers in the middle who were genuine, these beautiful, mostly black women, mostly in their 30s and 40s and 50s, mothers, grandmothers, you know, who absolutely knew that CSEA was a phony operation in there that time, and absolutely could not take a radical position, a militant position, on the other side with the black nationalist leadership in the institution. It was immensely interesting, immensely interesting. And so our lives were making friends with people with names who we grew to love. I mean, we had tons of people that we were interacting with at a very wonderful level. I mean, it was good relationships, you know, because we were there to serve them, unconditionally to serve them, and there was no reserve on our part. We were there for them, as long as they were there for the people who were at the bottom.
Tell me a little bit more about, because I know in some of our off-camera conversations we were talking about what you would do in terms of healthcare needs of some of the individual workers,
Right.
and how that helped to build the relationship, and how that came back to support you in some ways.
Well, there was an issue about how much you would touch the residents, and we would touch the residents. That was the days before contact isolation with the HIV and AIDS epidemic. All healthcare workers started to wear gloves, but we didn't wear gloves in those days. But 100% of the residents of Willowbrook contracted hepatitis within the first 6 months of being in that institution, which was the justification for carrying out viral research at Willowbrook. And it was at Willowbrook that Saul Krugman, a well-known virologist, and actually characterized the difference between hepatitis A and hepatitis B. Hepatitis A is the kind of hepatitis that you get, you know, in a restaurant where some cook with hepatitis A is cooking and doesn't keep their virus out of the food you eat. Hepatitis B is more of an injected hepatitis. Hepatitis A will come on about a month or so after you are exposed to it. Hepatitis B will come on at a much later period of time, and so they carried out experiments in which they would have the patients ingest what was essentially capsulized feces of other patients and this was in the research building that Bill had talked about earlier, to see how long it would take such a person to develop hepatitis. And they did find that there would be one set of hepatitis that would occur quickly, and then another kind of hepatitis that would occur later, and it was called hepatitis A and hepatitis B. And so that research was done at Willowbrook State School. And the point is that we would be willing to touch the patients. They would come up to you, and you would have to either have an adversive reaction or embrace them. I mean, there wasn't much choice, and so we chose to embrace them. And so that was one area where we tried to set an example, because the employees certainly had to touch them. And to talk to them about what the chances of them getting hepatitis might be as best we knew it, and how they, by hand washing, they could help to keep from contracting diseases that could be spread from the patients to themselves. And they would come to us with sinus problems and all of the minor problems that you might go to your family doctor, and that we would help to take care of those as best we could.
Any worker that needed medicine, we'd write a prescription. You know, we'd take care of them. We wouldn't do house visits, of course, but if they came to work and they were sick and they asked us to take care of them, we'd examine them, we'd treat them. You know, and they came to work sick, and they wouldn't even ask, and we would, at the beginning, I would say to them, "You're not feeling well," and they wouldn't want to fess up to it, and we would say, "Come on, what's the matter? How you doing? I mean, you know, I'm a doctor. You can trust me." You know that line? And little by little, you know, people got so that they felt that we were there for them. That was crucial. We had to be there for them, heart and soul. Otherwise, nothing was going to change.
And how did this play out, I mean, particularly when the administration was trying to discredit the two of you?
Well, I think that the people that worked there found it really difficult to publicly take our side, because they were vulnerable people themselves, and they could only know that we were not evil people, and that we were good human beings that had been trying to do a good job. And so, as I mentioned, when the expose came out, they would not tell their supervisor. They would passively support us. Most of them would find it difficult to actively sign up for change in the institution, because they saw us getting vilified, and they weren't in a position, most of them, where they could really afford to do that.
When the chips were down, however, there was a great piece of theater that we haven't talked about up to now, and that was that when Mike and Tony Pinto, the head of the Benevolent, came the day after, cutting the deal with the commissioner, Alan Miller, and Grunberg, about Michael and Liz being rehired, with the message from the commissioner to Hammond. You heard that there was this enormous melee, and that the administration had provoked a hysteria on the institutional grounds, and people were running around like crazy, and they had menaced Mike and Tony very seriously. I mean, it was a dangerous situation, because they were being really whipped into a frenzy. 2 days later, a meeting was called that the administration engineered to bring all the workers off the ward to the auditorium, and they had signs all over the administration. All the churchmen were there, the chief psychologist was there, Jacobs and Murphy, all of them were there, and they had selected key workers from my ward, from 76, you know, who had essentially been part of the group that had led to my expulsion from that building. And they put on this incredible show denouncing us and demanding that we be fired, and that they should never rehire Mike and Liz. All of this was a giant piece of theater in order to force the commissioner's hand to renege on demanding their rehiring. And so they had all the brass there lined up, and they laid it down on the workers, and the workers were there, you know, like sheep in this room. And they dismissed the meeting. There was no Q&A, no nothing, and they called then the afternoon shift. But what was interesting was, because these are, you know, bureaucrats that have no stake, the bosses went home at 4 o'clock. So there was no brass there. Hammond wasn't there, the chief psychologist wasn't there, the head nurse wasn't there. They left it to the B team, and they tried to replay the indictment of us and to whip up this hysteria against Mike and Liz. And as they were denouncing from the stage our being racist and not caring and being really the problem and trying to get their jobs, one of the guys, one of the African-American young new workers, his name was Felton King, I remember, stood up and just said, you know, you are so full of it. These are our friends. They have never done anything wrong to us. They've only been there to take care of the people. They've only been there to take care of us. What are you talking about? And you know, the magic was broken. It was broken. And right away, the administrators got frightened, and they immediately dismissed that afternoon gathering and sent them all back to their wards, and that was the end of that. I mean, all it took was one worker to stand up in a context like that. Now, you got to be careful about when you stand up, what you say, and how to build protection around yourself, as our opponents were doing, in order to do the right thing in these kinds of situations. And, you know, had it happened 2 months earlier, they might have been ground into the dust by standing up and opposing the hit on us. But a lot had transpired. They had learned a lot, and there was a new cadre of young workers, because it was constant turnover there, that didn't come in with the indoctrination of compliance and sort of house worker consciousness, you know. And when they stood up, it was so moving for us. We weren't there, but when we heard the story, and then they talked to us afterwards and told us what happened, I mean, we were so grateful. I mean, we were so grateful, because, you know, anything could have happened to us, anything. I mean, you know, we weren't invulnerable, we were just brave, you know. And, you know, this was all new. There was no blueprint for this mess. This was really out of this world. I mean, it was a wild hare's ride, I'll tell you. We didn't know what was going to happen. But it was big, and it was aimed at the governor. This was not to get rid of Hammond. This was not to fix Willowbrook. I mean, you got that already. You know, this was an aim at reforming a whole system and changing the inhumanity of segregated congregate care, and to implement a policy of normalization in human services, in the human service field, and to emancipate these people who were really hostages, public hostages, being paid for with public ransom money, you know, to die there under the most ignominious and inhumane and violent circumstances.
That's a good break point. Continue on. I wonder if you would talk a little bit about the lawsuits. I know we talked about the lawsuits being filed. What was the result of the lawsuits, and do you think that it led to some appropriate and meaningful reform?
Absolutely. Bill, you know more about that than I do.
You know, we filed the lawsuits based on trying to build a national movement, because we had a wonderful coterie of legal colleagues that were really interested in carving new ground in this whole area of constitutional rights and class action lawsuits in human services against states for human abuse, and mostly institutional abuse. And what was interesting was that this really was the next step, the next significant step in the civil rights movement, because we had essentially inherited the ball for a short run that we were taking from the black community and the civil rights, the African American civil rights struggles that were going on. And for a period of time, while we were in motion, it was the disability rights agendas that really were the most cutting edge, the newest formulation of what would really make quality of life and what undermined quality of life in society. So the suit that was filed at Willowbrook turned out initially to be a very limited suit, because the judge gave us a very narrow window in which to address the problem, and that was an Eighth Amendment violation of freedom from cruel and unusual punishment, rather than giving us the kind of broad-based position that we could take, similar to what had happened in Alabama in the Partlow case, which was a right to habilitation, right to treatment, right to education suit. But the hearing that was subsequently held, and hearings went on for 15 years. I mean, the state of New York was incredibly resourceful in blocking us at every turn, in delaying us at every turn, in promising things at every turn. And no federal judge was really ready to stick it to them, even though they established a federal master over Willowbrook. One of the things that they would not let us do is to establish a statewide class, and they limited the class action to just the Willowbrook residents, which, you know, right away coned it down. We were really interested in system reform, not fixing Willowbrook. That was just penny ante, but that's what wound up to be the big card. So what came out of that was a systematic, first of all, there was some cosmetic increases as a result of the suit was a remarkable piece of theater. I mean, the transcripts are magnificent. The testimony was absolutely unique in the country in terms of the kinds of people who came to talk about as experts what was and wasn't compatible with life on Earth, you know, and that the people we were talking about fell into that category of life on Earth like the rest of us and needed to really be understood as a source of continuous development, continuous growth, continuous maturation, and a crucial civil role in everyday life as valued citizens. So issues of image, issues of comprehensive programming, issues of the least restrictive alternative or possibility of how you would support somebody's growth and development became the watchwords of the system. Not only individual planning that had to be provided, advocacy agendas that had to be put in place, safeguards against abuses, transparency in the way things would work, parent involvement and family involvement in all planning and decision making. And as we became more successful, filing suit after suit across the United States in more than 35 states with the assistance of a particular wonderful guy, I think his name was Mike Thaler. He was with the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division with his amicus suits flowing his testimony with us because the federal government had an interest at that time in cleaning up this situation. And the result was that the federal government began, the Congress began to pass laws to implement right to education, which was a spectacular breakthrough. And then the state of New York did what they did in terms of slowing down and stalling our effort to transform. They, in turn, began building more institutions. I mean, it was absolutely amazing. It was just schizophrenic, because what was driving the New York agenda was always money, big money, specifically federal repayment dollars, hostage ransom money, and nothing really changed. Now, in the meantime, this has been going on now, you know, for 20, almost 30 years before the situation was finally transformed. I don't know what year the institution was finally technically closed. It's been maybe now 7, 8, 9, 10 years.
Right, around 2000.
Yeah, we can find that out. But you know that still the back part of the property is still used for housing grown-ups, you know, in squalid conditions who stand around looking squalid, just like the people did at Willowbrook that were able to get out. And on the other hand, the impact on the nation has been phenomenal. The changes, like with the Civil Rights Act, questionable. You know, we passed the Civil Rights Act that outlawed discrimination against people of color, and we have a more segregated nation than we did then. We outlawed discrimination and congregation of people with special needs as a result of these 35 lawsuits all over the country. We have every bit as much a segregated program, except it's smaller. You know, now we're talking about 6 beds, 12 beds, you know, but it's stigmatizing money in stigmatizing settings, you know, managed by people who carry a stigmatizing label to people who are required to be labeled in a stigmatizing way. So we still have this we and they situation, and now, as I want to repeat over and over and over again, the reality of the threat now is in the face of every single human being in America. And the new disability is getting old. And if you think you're not going to go down that path, you know, wake up, because this is the time now to make this transformation. And those struggles were paradigmatic struggles for this.
Let me ask you this. Do you believe that unions have a particularly important role to play in the oversight and care of protection of employees who seek to remedy deficiencies?
Great question.
Yeah, I certainly do. Because one of the important things that people working in a human services area have to do is to be able to see their clients, the people that they're taking care of as human beings, and then respond in an appropriate way. But they have to be protected in order to do that. And it's only a union that can protect them, to allow them to give voice to raising issues of quality of care. It's a responsibility of the union to make it clear to the union members that that's part of their job and their calling, and it's a part of their responsibility to protect the worker when they plan to do that. And it's an important, very important thing. And when you're talking about caregivers, that this be a job that's well respected, that it's not a dead-end job with a glass ceiling, that there's a career path that can be defined, there's a job description, and it's only a union that's going to accomplish those goals. So in order to provide better services for handicapped people, elderly people, incarcerated people, anybody who finds themselves being taken care of in a global sense, by the system, the government, that the union be able to unify the caregivers so that they are strong, because they will bond with the people that they're taking care of to be able to provide the services, and they won't be leaving that job for a job where they have better benefits and better wages someplace else. This should be a well-respected job, and it's through unionization that can occur.
I think the question is really as important as a question as you've asked us all together now, because you're really raising the question of what a future society is going to look like. The trade union movement has always been very preoccupied with economic and material realities rather than dealing with policy questions about the war, about the environment, about quality of life. I mean, the struggle when you go in for negotiations is around time off, is around safeguards, is around grievances of one sort or another, is around payroll and so forth. A human service union that cannot articulate a principled, perfect world of human being is not handling its ultimate essential role. Without describing what kind of a world and what kind of a life and what kind of relationships people should expect as a matter of due and right, the ground in which they deal with how they work in an unacceptable context is unacceptable and totally unstable. The union should have demanded, first of all, a rigorous definition of what constituted humane working conditions, humane work, and humane relationships as the ground of protecting their jobs and their own situation. Right now, what you have is this enormous fracture and schism between the state worker or the public worker in a well-paid, relatively well-paid, a side benefit package, and the community-based workers who basically are operating at much less income and no stability in the nonprofit and private sector. Generally speaking, state workers are always in a better, public workers are always in a better place than private nonprofit or private workers at a certain level in the area of human services. So the role that the union has to play has to be to envision an ideal world, an ideal society, ideal sets of relationships where there has to be an appreciation and an authentic commitment to something beyond just the safety and the right in front of your nose conditions that the workers need to have this particular contract round. Once you become diplomats for quality of life, legislators for quality of life, definers of quality of life, then you're really in a position to be able to talk about what is the working context in which to nourish that vision. Those have to be created in serious discussion sessions and dialogue throughout your entire membership. They have to be the guarantors of democracy. They have to be the guarantors of empowerment. They have to be the guarantors of health and well-being. They have to be the guarantors of high, and significant living. That language doesn't even show up in the discussions of the organized working class. And without the organized working class able to articulate that vision, who will do that? Do you think that the bankers will, or the boards of the insurance industry, or the pharmaceutical barons, or the war makers and the war industry, or the police, or the courts? I mean, who is going to bring mothering and fathering and familying and communitying into the dialogue? What you're seeing now is a very interesting contradiction where working class parents have by default become, again, antagonists to the organized labor movement around the whole question of being open to providing direct services for dollars for their children, professionalizing their organizations, surrendering their independent advocacy positions. And then you have this fracture between the organized workers and the organized parents, because the parents have now become bosses, rather than seeing that an alliance had to be built to look at the tax base and a government that is really the enemy. Not that the government is an enemy, but this government, because it is at the behest of the corporate elite, wealthiest interests, is unwilling to change its priorities from putting in $33 trillion to make war in every country practically in the world and generating death, to a government from the people that's willing to commit themselves to putting that kind of money into life.
Well, let me ask the two of you, as we're kind of coming around to our conclusion here, how have each of you been affected personally by the experience of what you went through at Williowbrook?
Well, I think there's a somberness that I approach life through or with that comes from having seen the suffering of the clients there and feeling not able to do anything about it. You're powerless in that environment. You just have to stand there and see it, and somehow you feel like you're evil, or you just sort of get used to seeing what is the definition of evil, in a way, as Bill said earlier. So that's it's sort of like, I think, somebody that's been in a shooting war, in a big battle, or somebody that's been to Iraq. You come out of that different. I work with veterans in a veterans hospital, and these guys are different, and you can sort of see that somebody was in the Korean War. That was a certain kind of war. World War II was a certain kind of war. Vietnam, Desert Storm, and now Enduring Freedom, as it's called. And these are some angry and hurt people. And so been in Williowbrook, I think, is a little bit analogous to that, just because you see a side of life. But I would say that the most important way it's affected me is as a parent. I would not be away from my kids. I will be, when they were young, I would be reading to them every night when they went to bed. I would be with them. I would not ever be away from them, because I would be afraid that I never want them to have to go through anything like that was at that institution. And it was only when they were fairly old and the grounds of Williowbrook State School had been converted to the College of Staten Island that I was able to bring them to Building 6. And actually, we have a photograph of my kids and my wife and me standing by Building 6. But I wouldn't have taken them there for a long time after that. So it was that part of parenting, and then the the part of parenting in which you catch them being good. You see, as a parent, the goodness in your kid, and that was what nobody would see in the clients at Willowbrook, the inmates there. They were seen as being a more like an animal than a human being, and their potential as a human being was being denied by everybody. And so I would say the opposite of that should be what you would want for a child. And so my parenting role became much more protective and fierce than it would have been otherwise, I think.
As a result of that struggle, you know that it reached a place where I finally testified before the federal court and began to just lock myself in my office at work because I was just absolutely burned out. And somehow or another, I was able to engineer an educational paid leave for 2 years where the institution really was so glad to get rid of me. And they paid for my salary, gave me full salary to go to Syracuse University to do a postdoctoral study period there under Burton Blatt and the education department and Wolf Wolfensberger. And it was an incredible experience, and I needed it in order to just reconstitute. During that time, I wrote a book called Public Hostage, Public Ransom, Inside Institutional America, as a way of trying to capture and present to ordinary people what it means to be an ordinary person in an extraordinary situation that requires skill and imagination and creativity to fix. The book hasn't been published in all these years, but it's a 500-600 page manuscript with photographs from the operation. But writing that book was an extraordinary experience for me, because for the first time I wasn't in the fight every second, and I could sit back and summarize what I had learned and what I understood and what I felt had to be shared. And then I immediately went to California, where after I left Syracuse after 2 years, and was hired to be the medical director, the statewide medical director of the developmental service system in California. And I brought with me all the lessons, all the experience from the New York struggle and the one before that when I was in Kansas before I came to New York, and was able to have an extraordinary influence on the definitional system of the program in California, whereas it had been called the Developmental Disabilities Program. You know, as small as this may be, I renamed it the Developmental Service Program because we weren't generating developmental disabilities, we were producing developmental services. I was able to frame a whole policy on labeling, because how we use language and what we call people, we call them diagnostic names like the retarded and autism or whatever, as opposed to people with, and put the people first always. And then set up an entire evaluation set of criteria to look at the quality of services tied to funding in California based on a progressive strategy of how normalizing the service delivery system was. A major campaign to train workers in the normalization strategy and specifics, and how to learn to look with X-ray vision at what they were doing, to be self-conscious so as not to, through ignorance or even malice, impose conditions and relationships and circumstances that absolutely killed people's image and their spirit. Continued to work with Wolfensberger, you know, on a distant basis, you know, around the whole training session that he was constantly doing to build a national competent cadre group, a coterie of top people from all over the United States that understood how to organize human services in a way that were totally enhancing. Over the years, I got to tell you that a lot of damage was done, and it's now very hard for me to re-submerge myself in the disability world. It's like it's just too heavy right now, and I keep saying to myself, on the one hand, I've really spent my coin to the point of deficit, and so now I organize high school kids without disabilities, not intentionally, but because the disabled community is so segregated that I can't recruit high school kids with special needs into this vast California statewide youth media operation that I run in California, which at some point, you know, I'm going to have to square off and deal with, because segregation lives and is well. And as long as it lives and it is well, we are all in dire threat of falling prey to the savagery, the viciousness. It's carnivore character. It's dehumanizing, you know, character.
Certainly the two of you achieved quite a lot, did a lot of good, maybe at some personal sacrifice, but certainly you found some inner strength to be able to do that. What words of encouragement would you have for others who might be struggling with those kinds of issues?
Words of encouragement would be to serve the people, be where people need services the most, try to work with the neediest people, and then see them, receive them as an individual, and be open to their potentialities, and educate yourself well about what their needs are, and unite with the people around you to make change if change needs to be made, or simply to work within the system and serve them if that's what's appropriate. But to be going in with an open eye and to define yourself not as yourself within your skin, but to realize that we're really part of our environment. We can't define ourselves outside of the defining who we are with relationship to our environment and the people that we're around, both the people we're serving and our co-workers.
I would say, first of all, that people need to really always stand bravely against abuse that they see, and smartly against abuse that they see. Too often, somebody will react to a bad situation, expose themselves to premature censorship or loss of job, and then assume that things can't be fixed because I tried and it didn't work. Everything can be fixed. It's a matter of how you build the base that always involves networking and organizing and bringing people together around programs and agendas that can be melded together from a variety of different interests to build a richer context, a more strategic context of challenge to human abuse, to segregation, to racism, to sexism, to ageism, all of which we face all the time, to war and so forth. The single most significant thing that people need to be working towards and locked into now is the establishment in America of a universal, single-payer, rightful, single-tier healthcare delivery system. We don't have a healthcare system in America. We have a medical service system. It's all driven by profits, and it is the most savage and barbaric system on the face of the earth, given the scope of it and its impact in all of our lives. And people don't get that we are all in the same soup together. Everybody thinks that handling their aging auntie or their grandparents or their kid with disability or whatever is their problem, and that whether they can afford the insurance or afford the copays or the deductibles or get excluded from services or whatever is their personal battle. It's not the case. This is the most profitable single industry in the United States, short of the arms industry. And the people who are making those profits in the trillions are not going to let go of this thing easily, even if 90% of the people decide that they want single payer. It's going to require enormous commitment on the part of people and study and understanding in order to change the context of our relationships in America through establishing a unified single service system in the United States that everybody has access to at one cost, one quality of care, and access to any service available through the private or public sector as they wish anywhere in the country. That struggle and that victory will change America from fearful and partly crazy and violent to a civil society with a strong democracy. The longer we go without that program, the more totalitarian, antisocial, violence-engendered, division-generating experiences will dominate our world. More consumerism, more madness, more externalities, rather than finding an internal sense of peace and community and identification with everybody around you. Working on behalf of the most profoundly dependent people in the society requires us to think about the most nurturing and universally inclusive interdependent society. And that's a great thing to devote your life to in whatever you do, wherever you are. But as a union member and as a human service worker, you are at the epicenter of the opportunity.